4, 3, 2, and 1.
Hi everyone, welcome to Kiln's May Startup Stories. Usually we do these in our theater, but we're taking it virtually given the circumstances. And today we have Ben from Lucid. We're super excited to dive into his story and his time at Lucid. So welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started with just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into coding in the first place.
Sure. So I'm Ben Dilt. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I actually got started coding at a very early age. My dad was one of almost the first generation of computer programmers. Actually, he was one of those who got a job programming after a company had bought a really big, expensive computer and then had to hire somebody to figure out how to make it do stuff. And so he worked for EDS in Pennsylvania, decades ago, writing COBOL for mainframes. And my mom was doing accounting for him and some other local businesses, and she had a computer in the house, which was sort of unusual at the time. And my dad one day just said, we should teach these kids how to write programs on this computer. And so I was 6 years old. I actually confirmed this with my mom from her journal recently. I was 6 years old. My dad took me and my two older brothers and set us down in front of the computer, and he pounded out a couple of lines of code and hit run. And basically all it did was said, what is your name? And you type Ben, and it said, hello, Ben. And that was it, like end of program. But my 6-year-old mind was totally blown because the computer did something that it didn't do a minute ago. And it was so simple that I could see and understand how it happened, right? Like I understood how we got from here to there. And to me, this was like the greatest thing I had ever seen. I had this toy that I could make do new things. And so we had this Commodore computer, and it came with a big manual, big spiral bound manual of like how to write software for it. And I spent a lot of time as a kid just sort of playing on that computer and wound up, making video games and actually got my first job writing code while I was still in high school. The summer before my senior year in high school, I took a job at a startup in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and worked through the summer and have just been doing it ever since.
That's awesome. So given your background with that and your early curiosities of computers and learning how to code so early on, how did that eventually then transpire into Lucid? And where did all of that come from for you?
Yeah, so before Lucid, I took a job helping to start up a health benefits technology company in Park City called Zane Benefits. They're actually still around. They're called People Keep now. But it was me and the founder in his home office over his garage, sort of figuring out what we were going to do. And I built a lot of the early technology and the technology team there. But it was actually a really interesting project to work on. We were building products based on new legislation for health benefits. And so it was not, oh, there's 12 companies who make this kind of health benefit software. We'll just sort of sand off the rough edges and make a better mousetrap and sell it. This was, let's read the legislation and the IRS regulations and try to figure out how to administer these plans without everybody going to jail, because it's all protected health information and financial ledgers and stuff. And so it was actually a really cool project to work on as we were figuring out how everything was going to work. The problem was it was incredibly complex. Like it was necessarily complex. And so what we had to help us think through it was some flowcharts. And so we had a couple of copies. I think among 5 or 6 of us working on this project, we might have had 1 or 2 copies of Microsoft Visio on our computers. And honestly, even though it was a really cool project to work on, I dreaded working on it every day, because what would happen is we had this massive Visio flowchart, this huge thing that had how the information was going to flow and who's going to get to see what when and the order in which things happened. And it was 20 megabyte email attachments and printed out copies on people's desks that you would draw on with a magic marker and then drop on somebody else's desk, and you would wind up doing the same work that somebody else had just done, and it was just logistically working on this project was just a disaster due to the software that we had available. And so this was the spring, summer of 2008. And, in 2008, Google's suite of apps, Google Docs and Sheets and Slides and so forth, they were in their very early stages. I mean, they worked more or less, but they had figured out this core piece of value. And the reason that they became as popular as they did was that you were able to work on your content from anywhere, from any computer, and it would automatically save. And if you had multiple people working on the same document, it would just sort of magically all get merged together, right? Which frankly was always the promise of the internet, was that we were going to all be connected, we were all going to be able to work together, and it was going to be easy and better than ever. But that promise had never really been fulfilled, I think, in terms of working together until around that time. And so I went looking to see who had built, some way of building flowcharts together with other people. And there really wasn't anything, right? I mean, in 2008, graphics on the web were really difficult to do. And so there were very few people who had built applications like that. And I mean, the best that there was some half-baked Flash apps, and and so as I do probably too often, I just started building it myself, right? So on nights and weekends, I was working on the sort of the seed of what turned into Lucid Chart now. And I really didn't need anything really complex, right? All I needed was boxes and arrows with text on them. But the thing that I really needed was the ability to work together with other people and just not have to worry if somebody else was working on the same part of it as me, right? Like, I didn't have to be able to see their cursor moving and watch them typing every letter as they were going, but I needed to know that if I was working, that my changes were not going to overwrite somebody else's changes, and that I'd be able to get at it from anywhere, right? Those like the basic values of being able to work online. And so, I worked nights and week, like 20 or 30 hour a week kinds of nights and weekends, like real nights and weekends,
right,
through the summer and fall of 2008. And in December of 2008, I put up, that first working prototype of Lucid Chart. And I wrote to some bloggers and people had written about similar things in the past. And got picked up a handful of places, wound up on Lifehacker, I think. And within the first 10 days or so, I had registered thousands and thousands of users.
Wow.
And so I knew from very, very early on that I had struck a nerve, right? That I was not the only one who was just really fed up with this category of software, right? That even without any sort of marketing infrastructure to try to get more eyeballs on it, I could attract a pretty meaningful audience. And so anyway, that was sort of the very beginning of where it came from, and it's grown into what we see today.
That's awesome. So along this journey, how did you meet Carl's son, and how did that all transpire?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Carl is the CEO here at Lucid, and he's my co-founder, and he joined me very early. I mean, before I met Carl, there was no company. It was me and some software that I'd been building at night. I met Carl. So I launched the first version of this at the very, very end of 2008. I kept working on it through 2009, but in the summer of 2009, I think by then it was obvious to me that this had legs. It was sort of impossible to know at that point how far it could go, but I basically quit my day job that summer. And in the fall, I went back to school to finish up my degree, computer science at BYU, because otherwise my wife was going to kill me if I just abandoned that. And so headed back to school to finish that up, but also to gather together a team and to look for investors and to sort of turn this piece of technology that I've been building into a real company. I actually met Carl as a potential investor as a result of one of these like speed pitch events where, a bunch of people with nascent companies and a bunch of local investors can sort of get together and meet each other. And Carl and I saw eye to eye from very early on. I think Carl, he spent nearly a decade at Google. And so he was, as I say, he was really drinking the Kool-Aid on, web apps being the future of all software. And so he saw what I was doing, and he saw a real technology company, right? Not a marketing company that happened to have software that they used or sold, but a real high technology tech company here in Utah. And he got pretty excited about it and got involved very early on as an advisor. An advisor. I don't know what an advisor is. It means he bought us pizza once a week, and brought it down to school. But pretty quickly, we realized that we should be working together, and I roped him the rest of the way in. And actually, I should mention, Carl was, as I say, the first sucker. He did, in fact, write a check and invest, which allowed me to sort of quit my part-time job and focus full-time on Lucid. But also, he joined full-time shortly thereafter as CEO.
That's great. So you kind of just touched on this with the money started rolling in, so you decided to put more of your full-time focus, but were there any other things along this process that were signs to you that, okay, this is taking off and it's time for me to fully make this my job, rather than just those 30-hour weekends that you were spending on it?
So as I mentioned very early on, I had good signals from the market that I had something good. The very first versions of the software were extremely rudimentary compared to what you see now in Lucid Chart, but the very core value of I can access my content from anywhere, I don't have to worry about working at the same time as other people, and it's really easy to produce the content, like those were there from the very beginning. And if you go to the Wayback Machine, if you've ever been on that to go look what websites look like a long time ago, you can go look at lucidchart.com circa 2009. But you'll see that all the way back at the beginning, that was the value that was front and center in the product. And that was attracting users organically. And so I knew that I had my hands on something good. And basically, as soon as I was financially able to do so, I immediately threw myself into it full time.
So as you made that transition, what did crafting your role at Lucid look like as it grew those legs and turned into something that you are now spending all of your time focusing on?
Yeah, it is interesting. I have a different role at Lucid than a lot of technology leaders or technology founders have at their companies. I'm an engineer. I love building things. I've always loved that magic that I felt at the very beginning of saying, I made this computer do something that it never did before, and I understood how that worked. Like that feeling of creation has never really left me. I love attacking difficult problems and figuring out how to make it all work, right? And that's also what I'm best at, frankly. That's where my greatest strengths lie. And so reasonably early, we tried to figure out how to structure, me and Carl and the other early people at Lucid tried to figure out how to structure my role so that I could continue to add the greatest value to the company. Reasonably early on, we hired Brian Pugh as our VP of engineering, who came with experience leading engineering teams on pretty meaningful projects. And he grew into the role of managing all of the day-to-day of the organization itself, right? Of organizing the teams, who's on what teams, what projects are we doing, what's the cadence of running the engineering organization. That didn't end up falling to me. Brian took that and has done, frankly, as good a job as I could imagine anyone doing in that job, where I remained in a technology leader role, where I continued to work on the architecture and actually building our most important or difficult or strategically critical pieces of software. And so I will tend to move from one special project to another. When our storage systems were going to fall down because our user base was growing really rapidly, I needed to figure out how do you deal with a fire hose of people saving changes to, gigabytes worth of documents per second and save those across multiple data centers and take hourly backups and do it? Like, what's the infrastructure for that? What does the database look like? What does the software look like to actually operate that? And I, at that point, I took a couple of other engineers with me, and we literally locked ourselves into a meeting room for 6 weeks or something until we had built something to solve that problem. And projects like that tend to sort of take my attention, and so my role is about 50% individual contributor and 50% executive. I don't have any of the sort of management responsibilities exactly, but what I do bring is a deep technical understanding of how our products and all of our technology works. And I can bring that into executive discussions about strategy and what are we doing, what are we building, and why are we building it, and for who are we building it. And as we consider options about how we can move forward in the near and long-term future, I can bring the perspective of what will that look like in terms of actually building it and delivering it, right? And I think that that's unusual to have in the boardroom and sort of in those kind of executive conversations, a really deep understanding of what the technology stack currently looks like and how we might be able to evolve it over time. And so that I think is a core and unusual value that I bring to the company.
Yeah, so switching gears a little bit from more of the software building side of your journey, what has culture looked like within building Lucid, and how has that process evolved from you from the beginning to now?
Oh yeah, culture is an important thing. In the very early days of a company, culture, I mean, the culture of a 6-person company is the average personality of the 6 people sitting around a ping pong table trying to figure out what you're going to do next, right? Like, that is the company. You are the company. That is the personality of the company and the culture. And even in those early days, a company might be doubling in size every year, like we were for many, many years. If you double in size from 6 people to 12 or 13 people over the course of a year, everyone is still sitting next to someone who was there around the ping pong table figuring out what you were going to do, right? And you absorb the culture, and you have some inertia around the personality of the company and how you operate and why you operate that way. And it's not something that you necessarily say out loud, right? It's just sort of who you are. But when you're a 50-person company and you're going to grow to a 100-person company, you're suddenly in a position where you could lose a lot of that, right? And that's what happened about 5 years into the growth of our company. We were around 50 people, and we hired a lot from local universities. And so we were, in the spring, sort of staring down the barrel of growing from 50 people to nearly 100 people in a month. As we, had a class of people graduating from universities locally and elsewhere who we were going to bring on, and other people that we had made offers to. And we were deeply concerned, particularly Carl was deeply concerned that we might lose the secret sauce that made Lucid the place that it was, right? Growing to that point didn't happen automatically, right? Most new companies, new software companies, the default outcome is that you sort of wither and die, right? Like, it's hard. Starting a software company and succeeding at it is really difficult, and it depends on a lot of factors, both in and out of your control as the person who is working there. But a company that survives and grows to 5 or 6 or 8 people, and maybe you're nearing $1 million a year in revenue, and now you're a real company now. Most of those companies sort of stay that size, right? And the companies that somehow find a way to break out of that and have grown to 30 or 40 people, you sort of slow down, and that become like, that's the size of the company, right? And we were just on this trajectory of doubling in size in every meaningful metric every single year. And, and we were trying to figure out, why is it that we are doing that? Like, what is it that we're doing that sets us apart, that allows us to operate this way? And because we want to keep it, right? We don't want to lose it. We don't want it to become diluted if we, bring in a bunch of people who haven't seen it, who don't understand the way that we work. And so what we did is we took a big chunk of the company. I mean, like I said, we were 50-ish people at the time. We took probably 15 or so people with us, including a lot of the leadership group and some new people who joined the company to sort of be fresh eyes on it. And we went off-site. We went away from the office for a couple of days. And the purpose was to try to articulate our values, how we decide how to operate, who to hire, what behaviors we are encouraging, not as a aspirational exercise, but an introspective one, to sort of say, we are not, these other companies that we admire. We are Lucid, and we like, what is it about us that has allowed us to grow the way that we have? And we came away from that with a bunch of different things, but the most important, and the one that stuck, was this description of our core values. And if you, they might just sound like trite corporate speak to someone who is outside of the company, but they immediately rang true to everyone who worked at Lucid. And they have remained entirely unchanged for the 5 years or so since that time. The idea of innovation in all the different areas of the company, that it's not just the R&D group inventing the software that is doing, that's the source of innovation. Like, we have to allow ourselves to improve, right? We have to look at how the company works and find new ways of doing things constantly over time. The idea of innovation, the idea of passion and excellence in all the different positions in the company, the idea that those are tied together, that the people who are good at their job are the people who are passionate about their job, and vice versa. I don't think there's any way to separate those two. And so, like, what goes into our decision of who do we hire and what kind of behavior do we incentivize, like, that plays into it, right? Like, this idea that passion is important. The pair of ideas of individual ownership and also empowerment, where, like, it's the responsibility of the individual to take ownership of their work, to say, like, I'm not just going to do my little part of it and throw it over the wall to somebody else and hope that they can, deal with it. Your company will collapse if you operate that way. Everybody's sort of focusing only on their own job. That idea of ownership and the flip side of that being the company's job to empower you to make sure that you can actually take ownership and run with the things that you need to run with. Maybe most uniquely, the idea of the value of teamwork over ego, that there's necessarily a structure to a company, a reporting structure and a decision-making structure. But I believe that the idea that a person's position makes their ideas or opinions necessarily better than someone else's is poison, and I think is the cause of a lot of problems in a lot of companies. And so, the idea of teamwork over ego is that we do what's right for the team. We accept input from anyone on the team, and everyone on the team. And we believe that we hire people because they're smart, talented, passionate people who are going to be able to contribute. And if you truly believe that, you should be listening to those people, right? And like those kind of core values, that holding on to those. And then, as I mentioned, when we were 50 people, we sort of got together and tried to spell out what is it that's special about this place. The purpose of that was so that we could then start saying it out loud, right? Instead of just being who we are and it being sort of how we operate day to day, it became a mantra, right? Like this is how we operate, and you tell it to people, you paint it on the wall, right? Um, and you you regularly use those words to encourage people when you're rewarding someone for doing really well. That becomes a core part of how the company operates, and that I think was critical to our success to date, and I think continues to be how we plan to have success in the future. And so that was the really long answer, but
No, that was great.
the question was,
Important.
how does culture affect the company? I think that's it's the question understates the importance of culture. The culture is not something that, it's not a little part of the company. It's the personality of the company. It is who the company is, and the company's identity and behaviors, which collectively we call culture. That is a huge deciding factor in what companies are going to succeed and what companies won't.
You mentioned innovation. How has your time at Lucid and your experience changed your mindset on innovation, created maybe a relationship you have with innovation that you didn't before? And how are you ensuring at Lucid that there's constant innovation happening year after year?
Yeah, I think my idea of innovation was always, has historically always been around the invention of a product, right? And I think that that's the sort of natural place that your mind goes when you think of innovation. What I have learned over the last 10 years at Lucid is that the most important and most difficult thing that we're inventing is not our product. It is the company. It's the business. It's how we operate. And so my mind has been opened to a much broader view of what innovation is, where, for example, we actually had no salespeople working for Lucid until something like six or so years after we started, which, by the way, drove some of our investors or board a little bit up the wall, because we were focused elsewhere. But when the time came that it was right to start a sales organization, we sort of started behind the ball, right? Like we sort of started a little later than a lot of other companies did, but we started experimenting, and we hired a few people, right? And people who we believed to be really talented and really knowledgeable, and people who could do a great job. And those first 3-4 people, they figured out how to run a 3-person sales organization. But 2 years later, when it's a 50-person sales organization, it doesn't even vaguely resemble what it looked like when it was 3 people, or even when it was 10 people, or even when it was 25 people, right? You organize the company drastically different. The roles change, the definitions of roles change, the incentives that you provide to people change, right? Every part of the operation of the organization changes when you double in size. And when you're part of an organization that is doubling in size on the regular, you have to accept that everything about the way you operate your company right now might be right, or we might only be doing it because that's the way we did it last year, and we should re-examine it and figure out a better way to do it. And so that really is what I've learned about innovation over the last several years, is that you have to be willing to accept that the things that you're doing might not be the right way to do things anymore, and then work hard to research, but also experiment on how you might improve.
Awesome. So before we wrap up, was there anything else you wanted to share about your experience at Lucid, or any insights or learnings from those early days of trying to go out and solve this problem and looking at what it's turned to now? Just anything else you want to share?
I will say, I think before I started, people told me that it was going to be really difficult. to start a company. Same thing as I'll say to anyone else. And I thought that I believed them when I heard that, but it's sort of impossible to communicate how difficult it is to start from nothing, because there's no outside authority that you can appeal to, right? So there's no way to know if the thing that you're doing is right or not, or there's no one telling you what to do, or there's no one telling you that you're doing it well or poorly, or that that there's a more important thing that you should be working on, right? And that absolute total lack of external accountability and resources can be very, very difficult. And I didn't understand what that meant before I started. And you know, it was wildly difficult, but I wouldn't trade it for anything else. You know, the experience that I've had over the course of the last many years building this company has made me into the person that I am in a professional capacity. And so it's not for everyone to take your idea and to execute on it and to push hard on it, even when it's 3 years in and you're still not making the money that you were before you started, right? Like to continue to push and push and push, right? That's something that I think is not right for everyone, but for the people who are built that way, it's just the most rewarding thing in the world. And I encourage people who think of themselves that way, as that kind of a person, to find a way to do it. It's been really great.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Looking forward to having these conversations in person, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.